Thanks, Danny.
Hi, Rob.
Hey, Carree.
Mr. Travel Man.
Doing well?
So last week was a big week for you, and for EA and the 28-year-old Need for Speed and your 10-year journey with EA and the brand and the properties. So you were explaining to me earlier that this release was especially important for Need for Speed because of the reinvention that you went through and the return to relevance that you felt like you needed to perform for the Need for Speed, property. And it's that process of reinvention that I'm super interested in. So can you give me an idea of how you approach that? Because that's a pretty big nut to crack.
Yeah. It's been a really fascinating journey, actually, for me. Kind of twofold, really, because on the one hand, I was given the opportunity about 6 years ago to join the Need for Speed business, and it was around the same time that EA in general was starting to kind of wake up to this idea that brand was something which we should care about. Because curiously, for many years, whilst of course people use things like brand, they just meant things like logo. I don't think anybody really understood quite what brand could mean, the holistic presence of a brand and what it can mean to people in the way in which it shapes their experience of the world. I'm a fan of brand, what does that even mean? So it was a really interesting time to be joining the company, and it was great from speaking at a personal level in terms of developing I guess tools that I will continue to use throughout my career when approaching the subject of brand, because the company was so I guess junior, for want of a better word, in this domain. It allowed us all to discover together and make a ton of mistakes. And actually, my previous manager, a lady called Tabitha Hayes, was arguably one of the people who kind of spearheaded this work and laid down a lot of really fantastic grounding that we still use now. And the journey of Need for Speed is kind of fascinating because it's as you said, it's like a 28-year-old franchise now, which kind of jumped around between studios and like I say, because nobody really was looking after the brand so much, it kind of hit the zeitgeist, I guess, in the sort of early 2K period when Fast and Furious was a big deal, and just went hard, and it was bright and powerful and huge. And I think it was EA's biggest game for many years because of this. We just hit it exactly right. And then over time, I guess, as that culture was just very naturally superseded by another epoch in in what people were interested in, and cars began to become less relevant within a kind of a cultural context, Need for Speed started to see decline, and as a result, because nobody's really looking after the brand, it was just kind of passed around, and one studio would have a go and another studio would have a go, and it was never really rooted in any particular insight, but more just, well, I think it should be this. And sometimes they struck gold, sometimes they didn't strike gold, and arguably a lot of those studios made really fantastic games, but what they weren't was Need for Speed. And so it became very difficult for a fan of the brand to remain engaged and to be retained across multiple products. And so that became the job, was to take a look at what to basically build some brand foundation for us to then work with. And so we spent a considerable amount of time, going through, I guess, the kind of 3 phases of developing a brand strategy. Initially examining the market, looking through mountains of qual and quant, and trying to understand exactly what it is that people give us credit for. Because of course, there's tons of things we might say, oh, well, look, our competitor's doing this and we want to do that, and we've got a bit of a feeling that this might be the thing. The first thing we needed to do was to establish the fact that we don't get to decide what our brand is. Our players have already decided what our brand is. And so we got to start there. That's our baseline. And so whilst we didn't know what our baseline was, and so we went looking for that. And so we spent a lot of time in that phase, in that kind of early work, like I say, digging through these kind of mountains of consumer insight and all this fantastic resource. That's one of the things which EA has in spades is research, into our market, into our players, into the way people play our games, and it was my first real exposure to that as a brand marketer, and it was really is an incredible luxury actually to have all of this data available to us. And so yeah, we spent a long time with that, architected some materials which then became our kind of go-to, our kind of golden collection of guiding insights and a description of exactly what players gave us credit for as a brand. What are our our product attributes? What are our functional benefits? What are our emotional benefits? Stuff like that. Yep. What do we mean? What's our positioning? How are we different from our competitors? And then form that baseline. And so the first iteration of that brand strategy was the game which we released 3 years ago now, called Need for Speed Heat, and that was a really well received game. It wasn't particularly innovative. It wasn't doing anything profoundly new, but it was really solid, a really good, fun game people loved. But most importantly, it felt like the Need for Speed, which they expected. And they're like, oh yeah, cool. I recognize this. This is what I wanted. And that was a really, really important landmark, because of the fact that the brand had been all over the place for the last, releases leading up to it. It was really important to create that foundation, because otherwise we would always be judged. People would go, well, why did you do that? And why did you do that? And like, that's not what I expect. And so we needed this object, this product in the market that people could be our anchor, that we could then move from, because otherwise we had no space to innovate, because we would just be attacked for it. So it was really exciting that the studio managed to do that. And so 3 years of development between that game and this game. And well, actually 1 year, it's not strictly 3, actually, to give those guys some credit. COVID did a bit of a number on game development.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Great for game sales, not so great for development. And so the team actually had to go and help the Battlefield team midway through, and gosh, it was a bit disruptive, but they did it. It's been 3 years, and during that time they were able to then take some of the strategic initiatives that we knew existed within the market, and we knew we could attribute to our position within it, which others weren't, and really dial that up to really, really cement our position as how we're different from others. I think that there's a situation within gaming where if you're in a particular category, generally you're fighting for exactly the same thing. And so it ends up a bit of a race to the bottom. And so forever in racing, for instance, it's all been about polygons, the fidelity, how beautiful can it look? How graphically rich can it be? And actually there was the guy who runs the studio in the UK showed me this video they produced once, which was such a beautiful description of this problem, in the sense that I could Google now racing game, and then a bunch of Google images will show up. And actually, I, as the brand director for Need for Speed, have been for about the last 6 years, I couldn't tell you which one of those images was Need for Speed. That's a bit of a problem.
Yeah, that is.
Right? And it's like, because all of these games have been largely chasing the same thing, beautiful cars, beautiful settings, driving fast, all these types of things. And so actually, if you look at it, aside from a few tweaks to the UI, they're largely all the same experience. And so it stands up that, of course, the category of racing, whilst the other categories within gaming, such as shooters and other types of play, have exploded in the last 10 years, racing's more or less hasn't really grown all that much. And it's largely just down to the fact that we haven't really innovated. There hasn't really been any clear differentiation, because everyone's been going after the same thing. And so the strategy which we put Need for Speed on 6 years ago was to slowly begin to address that and really, really, really dial in our positioning, so that we can stand out and be different and offer choice as a clear differential from the other games which exist in the market.
So I think it's interesting that you look back to the release prior to the one last week, and you said that that's kind of the baseline. We use that in so many ways as a true kind of North Star right now, because the property had gone through multiple owners, you know, over its life cycle. I want to ask you one thing about that, and then we're going to go to something else. But with that baseline, you probably had some really good insights, some really good, okay, I know this is a keeper, and this is something we need to focus more, you know, for this next rev, like for last week. What were some of the things that you saw in that kind of 2-3 year ago where you went, okay, this has always been a part of this, but we've never really put any kind of focus or maybe extra thought into it? What are some of the things that you found there that you then built off of for where we sit today with Need for Speed?
Yeah, great question. It's one of the things which we recognized was that, and I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, that the fact that when we were at the peak of the cultural zeitgeist, when people really, really cared about modified cars and that whole situation, the cars were a thing, you know, that people really cared about. Yep. And what we started to realize, because authenticity is important for us. You know, we have a sub brand called Speed Hunters, which investigates modified car culture, and that's actually what you did before taking this job. Investigates modified car culture to try and ensure that the way that we present the modified car scene within Need for Speed is authentic, and it's not you know, trying to steal from that scene and just kind of cheaply represent it. It's deeply authentic. So if you're from that scene, you're like, okay, cool, I get it. This feels like my thing. So that kind of authentic thread is really important to us. And I think it's important to any brand, let's be honest. Like, authenticity is a clear differentiator, and it's how you create stickiness. But coming back to that for a sec, the thing that we realized was that as the people's appetite for car culture was just continuing to fade and fade and fade and fade, when we were leading with car culture as our hook, it's like, wow, this is becoming a real problem, right? Because we're having to sell two things. We have to sell them on car culture, and then we can try and sell them on the game. Like, that's not great. And so, but we can't abandon it, because that's the center of our experience. And so we thought, well, gosh,
you can't have a racing game without gearhead action in the background somewhere. You just can't. It's no fun.
Exactly. And so it's at the center of our experience, at the core of our existence, and it's everything we're built upon. So we can't abandon it. That'd be dumb. And so it needs to be authentic, but we can't lead with it. So, gosh, what do we do? And so we looked within our brand universe and, you know, everything that people give us credit for, and we noticed that actually there was a huge resonance within our community for people often would say, and this wasn't just one or two, you know, quotes that we pulled from some market research session in like 1993. We see this again and again and again. Is sorry, but you've seen that happen many times,
oh, absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
I probably still
one
have
liner.
some insight. Yeah, I probably still have some insights in my back pocket somewhere for some brand that I've never used yet. So I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. One liner apparently trumps mountains of quant. Anyway, like but one thing we saw again and again and again, which actually two things happened. We saw that the people spoke about Need for Speed being the thing that gave them their music taste. And it was like, oh, that's weird. That's kind of interesting, actually. So maybe we can play music. That feels like something which people associate with us. Okay, that's broad, that's mainstream, but it does have edges. You know, it's not just rounded off nonsense. It can have edge. So that's intriguing. And then the second point was, so we work really closely with the OEMs, or the automotive manufacturers, and and in speaking to Lamborghini, they often would say to us how incredibly sticky their social channels were. And so did a bit of investigation. It's like, yeah, sure enough, here we go. We've got Lamborghini. Everyone wants to be a part of Lamborghini's universe.
Oh,
and so they have colossal following. And you know, when you're walking down the street and you see a Lambo, it's like, oh my gosh, it's a Lambo.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And anyone can have that experience. And so we like, we had a bit of an aha moment. It's like, okay, cool. So actually, cars can be a part of exciting, magnetic, compelling, broad cultural appeal. They just need to be positioned within it in a way that makes sense. And actually, as aspirational objects, which are compelling and exciting, which a Lamborghini is, and associated with something which is meaningful to people around music, then started to develop a slightly evolved positioning that we could move Need for Speed into, which people already gave us credit for, and I think that's a really important thing. I really struggle when brands try to associate themselves with something which is cool without actually having any credit to do it. I think the brand needs to do the work first to earn the right to be there. And it so happened that actually with those two insights we found within the marketplace, we had the right to be there. But in Need for Speed Heat, which was our game 3 years ago, we didn't have the right to be there yet because we'd messed around with the brand too much. And so we created that authentic, very, very like, yep, this looks, smells, tastes like Need for Speed. And then in this game, we were able to explore this new angle where we could allow this kind of aspirational luxury lifestyle and the danger fantasy and the kind of music muse curator. We could join those insights up and create a positioning which was ours, compelling, sticky, and had broader appeal than modified cars.
Is it bad that I like to watch dash cam luxury car vehicle crashes on YouTube? Is there anything more fun than watching a fast car crash? So I get it. And then it's usually got some great soundtrack behind it as well. So I can totally, so everything you just said, I can see in my own absorption of content, if you will.
I love it. I love it. That's fantastic. No, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's the thing. There it is. It's like that. Cars within culture, they do definitely, outside of those who consider themselves gearheads or modified cars, scene people, whatever. There is a broader appeal. It's not so obvious, and the signals which allow it to exist are slightly different from where we were before. So it's just tweaks.
That makes a heck of a lot of sense. So I'm going to go and ask what everybody kind of is going to be asking this year at this time, since we're finally getting a breather from the pandemic. But I feel like 2023 is going to be the year that marketers put into perspective all the kind of crazy things that we all did to get through, to survive the pandemic, and in many cases, and especially in your case from the gaming perspective, thrive during the pandemic. I mean, it was a go-to. And I think we're going to be looking next year into how do we take everything we learned over the past 2 years in this madness and take some of that and make that a new way of working, because it really did open, I think, a lot of our eyes to different possibilities and how things can manifest in different ways. And I know you're really, really passionate. This came through so clear when we were chatting before about how to adapt a brand strategy without redoing it. And I think you're sitting in the perfect chair to explain that to folks, because Need for Speed went through so many owners and so many iterations. So the question for this is, when the pandemic hit and we all realized that people were going to seek refuge and comfort in the gaming side of the house, what were some of the things that you found yourself needing to be able to do to keep your presence and to potentially grow your presence during that time? And what are the things that are now going to become part of your new way of working because of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question as well. I think it's a funny one, because the way that the pandemic shifted everything about the way that we work, and it's while some of it seems to have kind of slotted back into its kind of neat formation, and more or less it looks roughly like it was before. There's other things which are profoundly different, and I suppose similar to the way sometimes we reach these cultural epochs. Some things we often will make these big declarative statements about, okay, that's never going to be the same again. Now we only do this. Now we only use Miro. We only use Zoom. Yeah. But the reality is, it's a kind of mix of all these things, right? So it's, once the dust has settled, what's really going to stick. And I mean, to come back to the kind of the first part of your question, I'm really, really passionate about the sticking with a longer term brand strategy, and it's really, really tricky, largely because of the fact that the communication trends shift and move around, and the way people play video games shifts and moves around, and specifically to video games. I mean, the pandemic, I mean, it just created it completely shifted the marketplace. But I think that the really important thing for us as people who work in games, well, at least I did. I won't next month, but
Well,
I
yeah,
did.
but we won't talk about that.
No, is that it was so it was we just blew it out, right? Because suddenly, as you say, suddenly people had all this time on their hands, and so they were investing, 10x the time that they were previously investing inside games. And so the ability for studios to produce the amount of content which these players needed in order to sustain their activity within the games, just it changed the game. And I think what's really exciting about that is that whilst it's really important to be a little bit sober and not expect that growth and that engagement to last necessarily at the same kind of rabid, consummation kind of like
Yep.
rate that it was, nonetheless, the pipelines for creating content and for adapting to the way that players are shifting and moving with inside the games, those processes has got way, way better. And so at a brand level, I wouldn't change a thing following the pandemic. There was a few things which we investigated just to make sure that they still held true. We, for instance, the aspirational lifestyle thing, which I mentioned a second ago, that was a insight which we had pre-pandemic, and the people's ability to show off has always been a big part of Need for Speed, and so we thought, cool, great, cool, we're going to go with that. And then when the pandemic hit and there was all of this, it all got a bit intense, between the have and have not, and people's ability. Drake famously released that horrendous video where he was showing off his new mansion whilst people were really struggling in other parts of the world. That was like, okay, well, let's not be those guys. Let's not mess that up. And so we worked with our trends agency, Foresight Factory, to go and investigate that, to see whether this was something which we could genuinely push our fantasy towards and not run the risk of ultimately upsetting a bunch of people and doing something which could potentially have long-term brand damage. And so I'm glad we did that work, and it did actually shift the way we positioned that within the game. And that work continues. And we're always double checking everything that we do to ensure that it's going to last and isn't going to be subject to a trend, or the inverse, that it isn't a trend that we've misread that isn't going to continue into the future.
Yep. So because gaming it's all about development. I mean, when you're talking about the back end side of it, it's a constant build, it's a constant reinvention in that way. And generally, in this day and age, engineers development works in a very agile manner. When I was at IBM, we took marketing in the agile side. So everything we did was kind of in that agile construct. I don't want to say fail fast, but because that's not the point, but I kind of wonder, did you take kind of a page out of that agile playbook from a marketing perspective, during COVID and then going forward, just to kind of what's going to stick, what's not going to stick? Did we get it? Did we not get it? Did we mess it up, or did we,
Yeah,
do we get a gold star for something?
I think I know that some gaming franchise definitely did. So the ones who are live definitely did. The live gaming. So the Need for Speed, whilst we do, and some of the other big EA games, whilst we do have a longer tail after the initial release date, and where we'll continue to publish content and big engagement pulses for the players. We're not a live game like a Fortnite or something where they do act more in that that kind of agile fashion that you're describing there. However, nonetheless, that's definitely the philosophy of the way we work internally. When whilst keeping, what we were talking about a second ago about keeping the long-term brand strategy safe from anybody trying to disrupt it or say, actually, that's garbage, that didn't work, that didn't sell enough last fiscal, let's rip it up and start again. We need to keep that safe. But what we do regularly is to take on new insights, new trends from various different sources that we have available to us, and then savage our work in amongst the brand team just to make sure it still holds. And by doing so, we get to watch whether it still makes sense, whether it still adds up. And so I think, because I'm a strong believer that whilst on the one hand, it's really important that we keep the edges on the work. So we can't make everything, smooth all the edges off until it's a little ball and it can kind of do anything. It can't be that. It has to have the edges in order to be useful. But additionally, those edges, everything needs to be continually tested to ensure that it still holds up. And if we're not doing that, then we're not learning. And so for instance, I noticed myself that actually, whenever I was speaking to CI, I would ask them to prove my point. I say, hey, I've got a theory about something. Can you go and find if there's some evidence of this? And then often come back
here,
saying,
people, back me up.
It's like, yeah, right. And suddenly I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. What am I doing? And I realized that actually what I should be doing is to look to prove myself wrong. And actually that became a much healthier yardstick for knowing whether something we're doing was right. When you have a hypothesis, let's try and make it wrong. And the stuff which lasts, that's the stuff which stays in the mix.
That's actually a perfect segue into another thing that we had talked about was, culture right now, societal concerns, trends. Those really are now table stakes for brands. Like you ignore that at your own peril, and consumers are demanding way more relevant. And I'm gonna use the word dialogue because it really is. For the last decade, we've talked about conversations with brands and consumers being a two-way street, but we never really kind of jumped all in with that. It's mostly push. And right now, consumers will have none of that. Consumers want their voice heard. Consumers want brands to interact. It's just not pushing those messages anymore. So, in the rebuild and the reinvention of Need for Speed, you needed to find a new place for it in the culture at large. And that really means digging further into the human element, the societal element, the culture, especially culture. So what were some of the things that you discovered initially? And if you notice, I'm a big fan of initial discovery and how you jumped off and where you went with that. So in a lot of ways, it's what you just described: testing your hypothesis, proving the hypothesis wrong, right, or otherwise. So how are you approaching culture, and how did that manifest in the current version from the release from last week?
It's one of those things that we like I said, as we were just discussing, it's something which we're continually doing, and it's an interesting one because it actually, again, to kind of quote ourselves from earlier in the chat, there is this gosh, how can I put it? There is a very natural human urge. Let's call it a mistake. No, let's stick with urge to see somebody say a thing during a qualitative piece of research. So call it I don't know, it's questions and answers, or maybe it's even something that somebody says on Reddit or on Twitter, and think, oh my gosh, we need to pivot now in order to address this. And sometimes whilst I'm always the urge, like, hey, let's slow down a sec. The Twitter is 0.25. It's a small number of human beings. They're the loud shouters, and yada yada. So let's not get too carried away.
It's even worse than the 80-20 rule. It's like how many 1-digit percent is responsible for
right.
most.
It's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. Yet for some reason we decided they're really, really important. And of course, you know, folks who live on Twitter, you know, they are kind of a diverse collection of human beings. And so theoretically, yeah, sure, there are some things coming out of that channel which we should listen to. So I guess that what we try to do is we have, of course, things like social listening, which are pulling from here. And what we attempt to do is we try to extrapolate what is genuinely a conversation from what might be bubbling in one corner of the internet. And if something pops up, whether it be one person saying it, 10 people saying it, or 2 million people saying it, starting to identify what that is, and then trying to learn from it. Because often, as we all know, if we ask people, what do they want, then they'll say a thing. Is that really what they want? It's like, what would you do in this situation? You see, and most people are going to make it up, rather than actually what they really genuinely do. And this is a kind of common parlance. I'm not the first person to suggest this. And so,
no, not at all.
Identifying where those real genuine insights are, that's the work that we spend a lot of time doing. And I don't think there's necessarily a formula for it above and beyond just being incredibly rigorous. And I could be wrong. There's a few of my friends who are really, really, really stupendously good analysts, and they might tell me, "Wow, this is exactly how you do it." But I guess in my experience, that the learnings that we get from our community come from everywhere, absolutely everywhere, and weighting those, but ensuring that we're listening to all of those is paramount. And some of those will mean instant communication back to the community is required, particularly in channels like Reddit, which can explode really quickly and then drag down scores elsewhere. And others are really, really, really juicy nuggets of inspiration that we can use to go on and inform massive, massive pieces of strategic work we can take us into growth in whole new areas. And things like the community's point of view regarding music being a really good example of that. That's something which really counts, and really it allows us to develop experiences which can really, really matter to people where they previously might not. I mean, I can also talk about, there's been occasions where we've developed games, this is not Need for Speed now, these are other games, where we've assumed that the people coming into those games wanted just big battles, but actually they were on a Star Wars game, and so they didn't want big battles. What they wanted to do was experience the Star Wars fantasy and be a part of that. And so if fighting can be a part of that, sure, but I want to be able to experience at all times feeling like I'm in Star Wars land, that I'm constantly in that lore and being surrounded by all these characters and these experiences and smells and sights which only exist within that Brand universe. And so that was a relatively small note coming from the community about that issue with one of our Star Wars games some years ago now. But the community management team did a really good job of finding that, isolating that, developing that into a pitch which turned around the entire success of that title. So yeah, that continual examination and discussion is such a vital tool.
It's interesting when you do research like this, because you do have your pile of qual, you do have your pile of quant, and then you've also got that little pile of nuggets. And to your point, the nuggets can be useful as kind of a one hit. Maybe this is something that's a flavor of the minute or something that's highly topical that you can jump on. And then others might be just nuggets that just sit in your understanding and your awareness, and you're like, wait, I know that there was this bubbling. I'm going to keep this on simmer, and I'm just going to see what happens with it. And maybe I can prove, disprove, or otherwise, but you never kind of throw away insights, no matter, good, bad, or otherwise, because you never know when those are going to become useful again.
It's so true. It's so true. And it's amazing the when I began in games, I always knew that insights, even it's one of the reasons I left advertising. I didn't feel like the client often give us the insights I wanted. And so I wanted to move client side so I could actually get closer to finding these insights.
Same.
Right? Yeah. And so and then once you start to see them real, it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And it just everything else becomes easy after that, right? If you have those nuggets, as you so perfectly put it, then when they can be described explicitly and they can be at the very center of everything, then the rest of the work becomes relatively straightforward and is always defendable because it can always come back to this deep player insight or consumer insight, depending on which market we're in, and then it becomes less about I think, I don't like green. It's like, doesn't matter if you don't like green, this guy does, and so therefore we're going green.
Yep, it's I just find it amazing when you do find those, because then they kind of take on a life of their own and they almost execute themselves. I'm obviously that's a rash sweeping generalization, but you do occasionally have those pieces where it goes, I couldn't have asked for anything more clear. Like, boom, we're going forward with this.
Yeah.
Hello, Diana.
Hello, Carree. Hello, Rob.
I was just getting ready to tee up the last question.
Okay, go for it.
So it's kind of a two-parter, but it's super short and super simple. So what was the one thing that you're going to walk away from 2022 with and run like the devil with in 2023? And then any just, last words of wisdom for, brands seeking reinvention and how that doesn't have to be the most scary thing ever.
Yeah. Well, I could talk forever about this one, so I'm going to try and keep it brief, Diana, I promise.
You get 2 minutes.
Okay, cool. I think we're witnessing some really profound stuff going on right now. In all of the kind of technical or digital epoch, cultural, digitally led epochs we've had over the last 20 odd years have always been inhabited, led, and designed by artists and the community and creators first, and then capitalism moved in afterwards, and that's more or less the way all of these things have gone. And don't get me wrong, I'm not an anti-capitalist in any shape or form, but it's an interesting pattern that has allowed maturity to come before the money angle comes in. And I feel like what we're actually witnessing at the moment is that happening backwards with some of the digital trends, such as things like metaverse and crypto and some of these other kind of Web3 territory emerging bubbles. And they are exciting, they are compelling, and they're really, really potentially rich for innovation and creativity and fantastically amazing work. But unfortunately, the commerce has come too quick. The capitalism is coming too quickly. And so the benefits are being described through potential abilities to capitalize on them, which is not particularly appealing and doesn't leave any room for creativity. And so I worry about the futures of those technologies because of that. And I suppose it ties in a little bit to your second question about brands, seeking reinvention. It lies in authenticity and creating something which is generally rooted in a insight about the market, about something that people genuinely want.
Yep.
And so if we start there, which is basically what the metaverse needs, and not capitalism, it needs what do people really want from it, then we have the opportunity to build something fantastic and exciting and authentic and therefore sticky. So hopefully did those two questions some justice with 2 minutes.
Makes perfect sense to me, and you came in right under the wire.
We're not going to kick you off. That was great, Rob. Thank you both so much for being here today. Great conversation. Look forward to seeing how this all plays out next year, and wish you both happy holidays.
You too. And thank you,
Likewise.
everyone. And thank you, Rob. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you so much, Carree. Yeah, me too. It's been great. And thank you, Brand Innovators, for hosting us. It's been fun.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks so much.